with the uncertainty over the outcome of any renegotiation between the UK and the Union and the looming referendum over the issue in maximum 2 years' time, it looks as if Britain's exit from the EU is now a possibility. Or is it? Now, with me in the studio is Viviane Pertuso of the French Institute of International Relations. Now, Mr. Pertuso, is Britain on a slippery slope to exiting the EU?
Well, possibly, but we have to remember that there is still some time for the UK to be sure that it wants to stay or leave the EU. I mean, David Cameron's promised a referendum in the next 2 years, so around 2017. It may come earlier or a bit later, but what's important is that now starts the campaign, now starts the referendum campaign. Before it was speculations and possibility of a referendum. Now starts the campaign, and now starts the real work, both for David Cameron, but also for the pro-EU camp in the UK, as well as for the anti-EU camp in the UK.
Yes, now that we are closing to the reality of renegotiations, now Cameron has won the majority. Would it give him a stronger position to create or to present the EU with a more ambitious agenda?
Well, it can go both ways. Either he has his hands free, so he can do whatever he wants, and he has a lot more room to maneuver, and then that can be useful, especially with certain constituencies, and that can be better to have the backing of the business community, in particular in the UK. So that can be helpful. On the other hand, because he's alone and he doesn't have any firewall, he can be radicalized to a certain extent by some of his backbenchers, and some of the rhetoric that he can present may be very, very difficult to hear for some of the European partners across the channel.
So would it make it more difficult?
Possibly. It all depends how he maneuvers. The chances are it's not going to be more difficult for him to present a strong case for the EU, but he has to be very, very careful in the way and very cautious about how he presents the EU, because he has now two constituencies to a certain extent. He has to convince the UK voters, but he has to convince his European partners as well, because his demands that he will present probably very soon to the European partners have to be agreed upon. And that's something that David Cameron will have to work on, because not everyone is convinced for now.
Even if there's no Brexit, that is the exit of Britain from the EU, do you think that the latest development, the results of the elections, have heralded some further loosening of ties between Britain and the EU?
Well, it's true that when you look at the bigger picture, the UK right now has a lot of opt-outs, and in the past few years, it's pretty much opted out of everything, of all the mechanisms that have been launched since the beginning of the crisis. So it's true that already the UK is pretty much marginalized of all things related to banking union and fiscal compact, etc. And that can go on and on and on, because for the next 2 years, the UK will be resisting a lot of new initiatives that may come to the table and may say, this is not the right time for us. And maybe there will never be the right time for the UK to join. So we may end up in this situation where the UK is left out of new initiatives which are becoming the core of the EU, and the rest is not necessarily just secondary, but at least not as important as it is today. And that can be very, very detrimental for the UK in the years.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pertuso. So stay with us while we go to London, to my colleague James Franey, our correspondent in London. He's waiting for us at Downing Street, the seat of the Prime Minister. Now, James, what's next on Cameron's Tory party?
Well, Fariba, good afternoon from a rainy Downing Street. Mr. Cameron has already got down to work, actually. No time for celebration, even when you win that parliamentary majority. Behind me, ministerial cars have been arriving, and in the last few moments we've heard that some of the first ministerial appointments have been made, and Mr. Cameron sending the message to the British public and the British voters. Stability is key here. He's reappointed George Osborne as Finance Minister, and Theresa May as the country's interior minister. In terms of promises that he made earlier, he addressed the media here just a few hours ago. Two very interesting points which will have implications for Britain's relationship with the EU. First of all, the Scottish question, which you mentioned in your introduction. Cameron has promised more devolved powers to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Now there'll be legislation coming up pretty soon as he forms his ministerial team. And as your guest Vivian already mentioned, that in-out referendum is now going to be a reality if Mr Cameron can renegotiate the terms of Britain's membership.
Well, very well, James, but tell me, why did the Labour lose?
Well, it's very easy, obviously, to say after the defeat, but I think we could probably look to the former leader of the Labour Party, Tony Blair. He gave a very interesting interview just 2 months ago to The Economist magazine, in which he said, I don't think that Labour will effectively have a chance of winning the election if it moves 1 inch from its centrist New Labour past. Mr Blair obviously moved Labour to the centre, and that was seen as key to the party's electoral success. So that could be perhaps one reason, but also, of course, Mr Miliband lost a lot of support to UKIP. Many voters that I spoke to over the past few days and in previous weeks saying, I used to be Labour, I don't feel they speak for the working class anymore, I'm putting my vote for UKIP. North of the border, of course, in Scotland, that complete Labour wipeout, that used to be a Labour stronghold for many years, with the Scottish National Party picking up votes with their anti-austerity rhetoric. Again, both parties riding this anti-establishment trend, and that's why I think Mr Miliband failed to walk through that door and become Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, James. Now back in the studio.